your lunchtime or whatever time that is for you. That's 12 noon on Central, 1 p.m. on Eastern. You are joining Job Seeker Nation, one of the few shows that regularly shows up and gives you free advice ad nauseum at times. So hopefully you'll get a lot of value out of here. Please comment and let us know that you're watching. Let us know what's going on with you. We're talking about long-term employment as well as a few other subjects there. Across from me, Jack Kelly, recruiter.io. How are you, sir?
Good morning.
Yes.
Voice of the job seeker, Mark
Well,
Anthony Dyson.
Almost the voice of job seekers.
I'm putting together. I'm merging it together.
Yeah. Well, too many thes. I just use one the.
Yeah.
Or one the voice of jobseekers.com. That's
Yeah.
me. So article came out this past week about people being long-term unemployed more than a year now. Many of those who started out being unemployed before the real pandemic hit, which would have been about a year ago last week for a lot of folks, they are still unemployed. And that brings apart some situations where they are now getting stimuluses, hopefully. Some people haven't gotten it, but a lot of people have, surprisingly, which is quicker than the last stimulus that we got. And we got more money. But of course, that's not a help, but they did go a little deeper, like tax credits and things like that. That's going to be helpful. But Jack, too many people unemployed for a long time.
Yeah. What's this, like what, 30%, 40% of the people
It's more than a third. Yeah.
Millions of Americans. And I speak to, it's interesting. You see the statistics. Then when you speak to people who are in that space, you realize, gosh, how frustrating it is.
Yep.
Where some of them were hit before not during the pandemic, but before, because sometimes at the end of the year, companies, they do a little house cleaning. It's a horrible way to say it, where they do some downsizing, some restructuring, some reorgs. So then you had people who lost their jobs back all the way in December, not this December, the last December. And then, they would think, okay, wait for the holidays, wait for the new year, things will kick in. And then before you know it, you had the pandemic and they've been out for a while. And I think a big problem that they face is there's this bias that hiring managers kind of feel, hey, if you didn't get a job, like, what's up? What's wrong? What did you do? Why didn't someone pick you up? So then it just prolongs the whole thing because they have this, if they're interviewing, they have this preconceived notion, like, why is Jack out so long? He should have got a job by now. Right. And it's rough. And then I think that just perpetuates that cycle.
Yeah. And it makes it a lot tougher for people to get back on their feet when they've been at this particular point. There are some indications that some employers are kind of releasing themselves from the constraints of the past, where they are, but not they are, they're foregoing some things. Like I'm seeing references kind of taking a more of a backseat this time, with people getting back to work and getting back to work quickly. Those who have, they haven't gone through the rigorous process like they have in the past, like the Great Recession. There were so many reference checks, and then it was fairly rigorous. And then they started, I don't know if you remember they started doing credit checks as part of the reference checks. And in most states now, they've outlawed that. But it's always some kind of new wrinkle as to slow down hiring and make people to go through the extra hoop. This time I'm seeing the people who were able to get work a little bit quicker, like the post recession. I don't know if you remember how that felt, but I felt like it cheated a lot of people, using standards that weren't fair and that they didn't cause. It was part of the industry and they were part of the collapse of that industry.
because it's frustrating. I'll speak to people and I'll ask them, hey, what did you do during this, let's say last 6 months, last year, last 9 months? And you can feel the frustration where they're thinking, but I'm looking for a job. That's what I've been doing. I'm not finding it. I'm trying. And, companies feel like, okay, they should have had something by now, but it's not easy for a lot of people. And as you pointed out, it depends. Like if you're in certain sectors that were hit hard, there's just not a whole lot of jobs around. There weren't a lot of jobs around. You know, some are better than others, and then that's maybe a little easier. But let's say if you were in the hospitality industry or the airlines, it's where you're going to go. They're all going through it. So I'm hoping moving forward, as we get the vaccines out, as we get the stimulus, as you pointed out, checks going out, that's things will start improving, and then they can pick up these folks. Then hopefully, so
Yeah,
there's more jobs.
yeah, yeah. I really think that we're going to see. I'm afraid that a typical March and April will bring about some spikes in unemployment and people being let go. It just feels like it's too quiet. And I know there's some that are upcoming, like Best Buy was one of the ones we talked a little bit about last week, where they're going to shut down stores and then rehire folks at part-time or hire folks at part-time, which is going to bring about it's going to bring some very interesting situations, because a lot of the stores copycat other big stores. So they're going to do that, and they see that they're saving money and that they're thriving. Guess what? You could see a whole bunch of other folks start to copy that particular business, blueprint,
Makes sense.
which is so, yeah.
Because it makes sense, because pre-pandemic, companies would have to come up with some excuse or get involved with pretzel logic why they're laying off people. During the pandemic, it was much easier to say, hey, we got to lay off 1,000, 5,000, 10,000 people, and just shrug and say, hey, COVID, that's why we're doing it. And then they don't get the heat and the attack of why you laying off so many people, because they're saying, hey, it's COVID. Moving
Yeah.
forward, it's going to be harder, but I think they still have that shield of like, okay, we could blame everything on the pandemic and keep, let people go, close down stores, and not get a lot of backlash.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to see if they're going to rehire those part-time. Of course, one major thing that hasn't been talked about yet, but I think is on the horizon, is that those people won't be able to get insurance benefits. They won't be able to get health benefits like they had when they were full-time, if they were able to have access to it, which I think a lot of them did. So of course, that's going to relieve even more money for employers. The fact that they're not having to pay in on those benefits, which could cost a major problem down the line, because I don't know how billing is going with the health aspect. But what if there are people who did have COVID, perhaps in, at work, because they're exposed to people at work, and they had to be hospitalized or they had to have some prolonged care, and they're going to get the bill now. Um, and I think there are insurance companies that may defer that bill. I mean, I don't want to sound like a conspiratist here, but I think, I wonder how all of that's going to work in the large term, and it will not only the fact that people will be underemployed, but they'll also be underinsured.
I never even thought about that aspect, and that hits hard, because if you don't get Cobra, you don't have your insurance, it's so damn expensive, and
Yeah,
especially for a family.
Cobra
Yeah,
is a huge cost.
yeah.
And I'm wondering how all the timing of this will work out for a lot of
Yeah.
folks.
Yeah. On a
And some
lighter note,
people, yeah.
no,
Oh, go ahead.
on a lighter note, go back to when you say about references. In a
Yeah.
way, it's such a game, because what happens is, they'll say, okay, Mark, we need 3 references. So what are you going to do? You're going to get people who you trust are going to say all sorts of awesome things. So
Mhm.
they're going to say, okay, hey Jack, is my reference. I'm like, oh, Mark is fantastic. He's great. I would rehire him again. He's wonderful. So they make, people jump through hoops, but it's kind of like, you're not really doing anything, because all you're going to do is get people who are going to say nice things about you. And the only thing, if you don't have anyone who can say nice things, that could be all right. So that could be a red flag, but that's going to be rare. So that whole process, like you said, it slows it down, and it really doesn't today. It doesn't really serve that much of a purpose. And I do notice with a lot of companies, when you ask them, because I'll get reference checks for people who used to, work here,
Mhm. Mhm.
and they really only want like what day they started, what day they left, what their title was, and that's really about it. So they're
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
asking. And oftentimes, let's say someone's really great, I'll say, "Hey, I'll be glad to give a good word. What do you want me? What would you like me to say?" And like, "No, that's
But
okay."
but
Yeah.
they're asking for more references than three in some
Mhm.
instances. They're
Oh yeah,
I've heard
that's a lot.
up to seven. And
That's
based on that,
that's
what
rough.
you've experienced,
Yeah.
uh, and again, it's going to be different for
Oh,
every
sure.
industry. But there were some retailers
Yeah.
before the pandemic, about a couple of years ago, that were doing applications on a first come first serve.
Mhm.
I guess that probably won't happen
Yeah.
as much
Yeah.
now. But all in all, the reference only really is good as the substantial or lack of substantial history of the employee. Why would you ask somebody for a reference check if they worked 10 years?
Yeah.
You know what I
You
mean?
gotta speak for
I-
yourself, right? If you
If they
have it for
worked
10
10 years at
years,
the company, what are you going to say? They did a
yeah,
bad job? Then
we kept it for
part of
10
the problem
years.
is you.
Yeah, that's a
Part of the
good
problem is
point.
you. But at the same time, if you are only there for 1 or 2 years,
Yeah.
then that's debatable.
So you should write down, I've been here for 10 years. What do you think? Of course I was okay. They wouldn't keep me for 10 years.
Right. So I'm wondering, and this is just a toss up
Yeah.
here, how how valid will employers take the LinkedIn references as
I,
people have moved on, that they can actually go to the LinkedIn reference, and
yeah.
to some degree, if they know the person, they're connected in
Yeah.
some kind of way, even as a second connected, they can just go right to the person and talk to the person off record,
Yeah.
which is uh, could be good or bad. But at the same time, it could shorten the time that people spend on references and actually get people to work a whole lot quicker, because sometimes reference checks can take
Take a
two or
long,
three
some
weeks.
take so long.
And for some job seekers,
Mm.
actually, you should be getting the most relevant reference check as possible. If you're chasing somebody from 10, 15, 20 years ago, good luck, because people change industries and location, and chase the way that they're connecting, because there's that boss that you had that gave you great review 15 years ago. You don't use as skills for that particular
Yeah.
job anymore. Only thing he could say is that you were a nice guy and that you worked with them for a long time. If that's all they need, that's fine. But I'm afraid that uh, that could be another useless hoop that companies can make people jump through
Yeah.
ultimately.
There's nothing more frustrating than when you're waiting for that reference check to get back, and some are pretty extensive.
Yes.
And you wait, it could take weeks. Some places I've dealt with definitely could take 2, 3, 4 weeks to get it through. And boy, that's
Mhm.
torture for people just sitting around waiting.
Yes, and I remember working for the city of Chicago as a substitute teacher, and even as a substitute teacher, they put you through a rigorous
Yeah.
reference check, and they check everything, and I can understand that because that's paid by the people, so they want to, and they they need to do that, and so does the federal government. They take a long time to vet and to get references, but everybody else is like, hmm, this is taking an awfully long time. What are you checking? Are you checking my childhood references? I
Right.
mean, yeah,
Let
how
me know
good of a
how
kid I
little Mark
was.
Dyson was on his paper route.
You're right. Good luck in finding the school that exists
Yeah.
because it no longer does. But all in all, it kind of it does prolong, even after you get a hot lead and had interviews and it's promising, it could still take a while. It seemed
Yeah.
like when you're in that position to get hired.
And then in between, they say, "Oh, wait a minute, we need to find out this. Oh, we didn't get. We need a copy of your college graduation, whatever. We need this." And then so
Mhm.
that even takes longer. It's like, yeah, it's there's so many things that go on that when you start picking it apart, you realize, gosh, it just got to be a better way. It's not.
Yes, yes, there
It's
has to
not
be.
that because I like that. Why couldn't you just put it on LinkedIn, right? Boom, put everything on LinkedIn. You have it. The
Yep, yep.
company
It's
looks
it's right there,
right
and
there.
and LinkedIn does a good job in
Yeah,
making sure, for the most part, make sure that the person who's
yeah,
giving you reference is real. Now, of course, you have to do a little bit digging
yeah,
because there's a lot of fake accounts too on LinkedIn, right? There's a lot of people who just come and want to sell you stuff and try to hack your account. Uh, get that part of it. You could just look at somebody's
yeah,
timeline to see how active they are and how consistent they are. Got it. That LinkedIn reference could be a great place to be the best vetting and to cut all that, because you're saving money, because ultimately most companies use an outside source to even do additional reference checking. In many cases, some of them do it in-house if they don't want to spend the money, so therefore the money they invest, they could save by looking at
yeah.
LinkedIn and say, hey, this person is for real.
Yeah. Can get a little insider stuff that I would see
Sure.
happen
I
so
was
that
about to ask.
so how you'll get this every once in a while, right? You'll get a reference
Right,
check. You get a reference
right.
check, and then the person will be like, Mark Dyson is really good at this, but you know what? He could use some work over here doing this, and he could improve here. And I'm like, what are you doing? That's not like, no, you just want to say good, positive things. So, and this would be like in writing where they would give it to us to give to the client.
Hmm.
And I'll be like, why all of a sudden are you giving this critique? They're not asking for a critique. They're asking for a reference room. And you would be surprised how many people do that. And it's like, well, you're
I'm
just
not
sabotage.
surprised.
And then I'll like talk to the person like, is it you don't like them? They're not good. And they're like, really, and I'll take them at their word. They're just naive. They're like, oh, I thought that's what it's supposed to be, where I just give a complete evaluation. Like, yeah, well, yeah, but you really want to say all the good stuff.
And this where it gets socially interesting. Let me give
Yeah,
you two. Let me give you two stories
yeah,
where this comes into play. A good friend of mine from
yeah,
college, uh, known him 40 years. And what he does in the health field, only like 20 people do in the whole US. So he has migrated from to jobs. And this one time, he was migrating after leaving a very toxic situation. He went to this other situation. They were interviewing him in the process. Guess who comes along? His former boss, who was the cause of this toxic situation, trying
yikes.
to apply for the same job, my friend.
Wow.
So this guy finds out and starts to give all this info that about my friend, who has really a very clean work record.
Yeah.
I mean, very successful, unimaginable, that we back in the day that we could imagine. He got it and then some.
Mhm.
But the company went with my friend anyway. But he told him, say, hey, this is what happened. Your old boss came along, and because he wanted that job, he tried to sabotage you. We got that. But you were the most vetted person we ever
Wow.
had in the company. You should know that, but you got the job.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just very interesting how people can find out certain things, but you have to kind of watch these days how you're connected as
Yeah.
you move up the ladder, because LinkedIn can also be that second tier or second connection you didn't see, that maybe your old boss is now either hunting for your job
Yeah.
or to be your new boss, or to have a connection to say, hey, you got to watch this person. And that's what happened to a former client. Actually, the former client was and I told this on the other show I do on Friday, is the client had the former client had interviewed with this other for this other position, but since the guys were colleagues, one talked to the other and said, don't trust her, and she didn't get that job.
Yeah.
So all of that to say, you've got to do a lot of homework when you're trying to connect and trying to do your references. You've got to do that one little extra little wrinkle. In many cases, probably not all, and let's say that they're rare. But those two stories show that you don't want it to happen ever. So you got to look at, your industry and how people are connected and what would people say about you.
Yeah.
And as well as a bunch of other things we could get into. But I think in the long term, it just extends the idea again that makes long-term unemployed, if you're in that situation, longer because of bureaucracy.
Yeah. And it's for them, I think if you're in that spot, you just challenges, you have to go into it knowing you're going to have people have misconceptions,
Right.
and you're going to have that thick skin knowing that people are going to kind of think why. So you want to have your story. Like this week, there are two people who I was speaking to who are in this situation,
Mm-hmm.
and one was a tax preparer, and he's been doing it for years.
Mm-hmm.
So I suggested, hey, put that on, to show you just did something, that
Right.
and that you did it, so you can honestly talk about it. So at least it doesn't have a big blank.
Mm-hmm.
And that goes for if you volunteered, if you did some gigs, some contracts, or maybe even where your spouse, your partner has like a really high profile job. You said, hey, you know what? I use this time to stay home, take care of the kids, do X, Y, and Z, and I've never done that in my life, and do that, and then come back later. But at least have a
Mm-hmm.
story to tell that can resonate with people, where they go, oh, okay, so if they were a little worried, they realized, okay, there's really nothing to be worried about. This person
Mm-hmm.
started a business, they had this gig, they had this contract, they tried this, they went back to school, they were a caregiver. So you want to be armed with that, because I think if you just say, hey, I'm looking for a job, that almost, I think, backfires, because now they're thinking, okay, you spent a year looking for a job, you didn't find it. I know it's a pandemic, but why? What's wrong? So you're
Mm-hmm.
almost setting yourself up for failure that way. I
Right.
understand for the people going through it, that's what you're doing. And I understand you're trying your hardest. And trust me, as a recruiter, I know how hard it is from my side. It's brutal at
Right.
times. I can't tell you,
Mm-hmm.
yesterday, I spent almost like the entire day recruiting for one assignment. I don't think came up with one good person for it. So it's not easy on both. It's not easy across the board, because
No,
some
it's
people
not.
who have their jobs, they're just hanging tight. They're not moving. They're just keeping their head down and hanging tight. So
Yeah.
yeah, so you have to, I think for yourself, you have to have a story. You have to have a way to describe what you're doing, so they don't think you're just knocking on doors, no one opened, and maybe there's an issue. You want to explain, yeah, obviously we all know how hard it is, but here's all the things I was doing, and keeping occupied, keeping busy, being productive.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that, and by the way, for those of you who are listening, if you want to comment about what you're experiencing while you've been unemployed, if you've been unemployed for more than 6 months, hit us up in the chat. We could talk about your situation. We're glad to answer any job search question that you might have at this moment. What are some of the crosshairs, some snags, some snares, anything that can possibly be tripping you up? We can give you our feedback and what we think. A lot of experience up here, so we'll be glad to help you. I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind as well is that people also become a little dull when they're experiencing long-term unemployment.
Like losing your skills kind of thing,
L-
or
Losing the edge and the enthusiasm,
oh yeah,
and losing losing the sharpness,
Yes.
of being able to answer questions, to be responsive if somebody should answer your question, because the employer is not the only one that's kind of vetting you. Everybody else is too, because some
Yeah.
people, it, for some reason, at least Americans, it's human nature. They say, I would help this person or I could help that person. And I know I could refer, but I need to know that, by me helping them, that I'm picking someone that can ultimately help me in my being seen as having good judgment in referring people. I want to have that reputation because that matters, right? Because
Yeah.
there's the underlying part of the working culture we rarely talk about is judgment and how you are with people. If you refer good people all the time, you're going to be seen in a much brighter light than somebody who brings busters, people who are not as good reference and don't
Right.
turn out that well. And so people who are looking on, they're also making that decision. If you're not being sharp, or if you're not being others focused, let's say, or you're not adding value, you're not, if you're complaining more than you are trying to be resilient, then people get the sense that you're not going to be as good as a reference as you need to be.
It's so true because it's just human nature too, where after a while you just feel exhausted saying the
Yes.
same story again and again. It's
Hmm.
hard to keep that enthusiasm, you know, when someone
Yes.
asks you for the umpteenth time, hey, how's it going? You're like, oh.
Yeah.
look,
Right.
look, it's rough. It just is, how can it not?
Right.
If you're kind of just a regular person, even if you have the strongest constitution, it gotta just wear you down over time.
Yeah.
And then to add on to it, you're stuck at home, you're not getting a lot of human interaction or a lot of interaction with people outside of your immediate family. So to your point, you get a little dull in the sense you're not as sharp because you're not talking about these things. You're not talking with colleagues. You're not talking to coworkers. You're not talking with
Right.
bosses and customers. So you kind of lose a little bit, and
Yeah.
that's the tough part for it. See, that's
Yeah.
where why it's so understandable why people would fall down this path and be unemployed for such a long time.
Hmm.
It's almost harder not to be that way than to be that way with the way things are going on.
Right. Right. And uh, you have to stay in front as much as you
Yeah,
possibly can. And especially, and that's why online is such the best way
yeah,
to not only to do that, but to be seen as a contributor. Because that's who people want to hire. They want to hire
yeah,
contributors, not people who are just taking by way of using work and using work as a way to get a check. So you don't want to be that guy or that girl, but you want to be the one that continually gives. And still, I would love to hear from folks who are experiencing that long term, and what they feel might be some of their hangups as we're talking. But to kind of shift a little bit, and I think this has this is relevant to what we talked about. I don't know, remember our Twitter discussion the other day about salary negotiation, about how you know people are really, people are not skilled negotiators necessarily. For the most part, people wait till the last minute to even think about negotiating salary, when that should have been one of the first things that they do when they start their job search. And even before you start your job search, you should know what your market value is, because you're going to have times when you're going to, whether you quit, you're laid off, or you've been let go, you're going to need to talk about, okay, what the money and benefits are going to be as you go out the door, and how long does it last, or whether they're going to give you a severance or something of the sort. And I think we came to some very interesting discussion about that, because there are some people who were involved. Our former guest Hannah Morgan was one of the people that was involved. And as you shared your point, I asked, that this thought was a magic question. I say, well, what point should people start having that salary discussion? Is it at the beginning? Is it at the, towards the end. I tend to lead to put it off as long as you possibly can. You gave some very interesting responses. You said it depends.
Yeah.
and there has
It's
been
so,
various scenarios.
it's very murky. It's really murky because, and one of the challenges, like something like Twitter, is hard to have a real dialogue because you're doing other things while you're tweeting. So you might tweet and
Right,
then you're actually doing your regular work and then you get back. So
right.
it's a weird way to have a conversation, but it's so
Mhm.
murky because here's what happens. What I see is that sometimes companies post their salaries, sometimes they don't. You know,
Most of the
when
time they don't.
a lot, right? They don't. And then when they give comp to, let's say, a recruiter who, because I got to share it with people, a lot of times they're coy. They're not really sound like, well, let me get back to you. Well, it's going to be here to here. What about the bonuses? Well, we can't really guarantee bonuses, but yeah, we'll talk about it later. It's weird. So like behind the curtain, it's not like they'll say, okay, we're absolutely going to pay 100,000 and you're going to get a 10,000 bonus and you're going to get this. It's really very ephemeral. They tend, and I'm generalizing, they tend not to kind of deal in specifics. And I think they want to keep it that way because they want to keep it vague. Um, and on one part, I can understand why, because this happens all the time. If you go to a candidate and say, hey, the salary range is from 150 to 200,000, they're going to, 9 times out of 10, they're going to anchor to the 200,000 because they're going to
Mhm,
say, wait, 150 to 200, I should get the 200, I want 200. So
mhm.
if you don't get that and you get like, the 160, you're going to be disappointed. You might not even take the job, even if you're making more money on it. Even if you
Right.
were like 130 and you get a raise, you're still going to be like, no, they're cheating me. So
Mhm.
it's a really weird psychological thing. So when you give those ranges, so often people will just see that high range, and if they don't get it, they feel they're getting screwed over. Even if it's still a really good increase. So
I just
even
find
then,
that
it's a
discussion,
bizarre.
but I find that very interesting because companies have budgets, and
Yes.
the ones that are being so obscure from the beginning, uh, you can't help but to feel that they're lying because they have a budget for that particular
Because yeah,
position.
they're playing the
They're
game.
just
They're playing
not.
the game.
They're, they're playing the game, but it's a unfair game because really the goal isn't to give the value. The goal is to game the candidate into taking something lower and to
I think
save
so.
money.
I think absolutely. You have no idea how many times I'll hear from folks saying, "Hey, do you think you could get Mark to take X?" Whereas, let's say X is 100, but they have a budget for 120, and they want to, and it's almost like can't prove this, but it's almost like a feather in their cap if the budget was 120 and you could get the person to take it for 100 because you just saved the company 20,000. So
And
that
it's
internal
possibly
hiring
tied
manager,
and it's possibly tied to their own bonus
I
at
don't
the end of the year.
maybe, or it's like internal pressure to do it, but it's definitely a
I think,
thing because a lot of
yeah,
times, you know, when there's a back and forth, they'll kind of say, all right, well, yeah, we can go up to, 120. And it's like, well, if you can, why don't you say that from the beginning? Like, why is it like you have to pull teeth to get it
right,
out there?
right.
So it's such a murky area. There's no like one right answer. And then when you speak to people, so if I speak to a person, I say right away, as I mentioned before, hey, it's 80 to 100. They're just going to think 100. That's it. And if it
Mhm.
doesn't 100, they're going to be miserable. So it's awkward to say that right off the bat because then you're going to get their expectations too high. So
Yeah,
it's a weird thing. And
and
it would be
it's not
different in a
clear.
world that I didn't know that happened because if you don't know that goes on, you could be like, oh yeah, say that because people will be reasonable, they'll be open-minded. But I can tell you, in my own experience, they're more often than not, they're not open. They're like, they just target in, I should get that higher number. And anything
Right,
less, it's,
right.
you know,
And
and then also a lot of people don't ask right away. Like a lot of times
and
people don't
I don't
ask
think they
up right
shouldn't, and they shouldn't
away.
because they're basing it on what the company information and finding more about the job and what that job
Exactly,
entails. And that's a
exactly,
very intelligent way to go about it. In fact, that's the way
exactly,
a lot of us
exactly.
advise that, because you're going,
Uh,
okay, I got to add things up. But if you're just telling me right off the hand at the beginning, say, hey, what range are you looking for? Well, you haven't told me anything about the job.
I'll tell, like, because a lot of candidates say, hey, Jack, when they ask me, if they ask me, what do I want? I'll kind of say the same thing you're doing because, hey, it's hard for me to say, let's say you're the hiring manager, Mark, it's hard for me to say what I want in base and bonus, where I really am still at this point, I'm not sure of the requirements, the hours, the benefits, the risks, and so on. And also, I don't know how your company works. Do you pay high bases and no bonuses? Do some companies pay lower bases but could give you a lot of bonuses? Is it a startup kind of thing where
Or
they're going to
base
give you stock?
incentives. Yeah. Or
So,
incentive
like,
based.
how
Yeah.
can it's not fair to a job seeker to be forced to say, hey, here's what I'm looking for when you don't really know enough about it. And then you don't want to, and then what happens too, if you shoot too high, they'll be, sorry, Mark. Yeah, you're looking for, 300. No, can't do it. You're like, wait,
But
no, I'm open.
And there've been times I've been told behind the closed doors that if the person does come with the right range, you're still told that it's too high, which is crazy. Yes, I do. Yes, I'm expecting between 150 and 200,000. That's what the budget is, but you don't want that. So that person comes in too high now. So it's a bureaucratic lie.
It's so messed up because uh, you know, so if you give something and you're just being genuine, hey, yeah, if someone asks you a question, usually, hey, what are you looking for? You want to go, well, yeah, I want 300. And then they'd be like, oh, that's way too high. Well, you just asked what I wanted. I'm throwing it
Right.
out there. Oh,
Exactly.
sorry, no, you're not going to be happy here because it's only paying, 250. Well, I would take 250. I'm only making 150. I would take 250. Give it to me. Oh,
Right,
sorry.
right,
It's a
right. And
weird
that's why,
game.
and
It's a
it makes a job seeker having to do, in which a lot of them don't do. And a lot of you who are listening and watching, if
yeah,
you've been long time unemployed, but you don't know your market value, you're hurting yourself at this particular point. You should be one of the things you should be doing is researching what should the market value for the industry that you want to go in. I understand some people are just trying to get a job. I get that. But at some point, there's going to be a day of reckoning where you're worth a whole lot more than what you asked for, especially if your expectations is just to get the job. You want to search it as if you just left your job, or that you're ready to go into a new market and you need to know everything possible
yeah.
uh, to get the right salary. And it doesn't matter whether you've been unemployed or not for a year, in your mind, in your
And
mind.
and another thing, Mark, here, this is another thing that people have to go through
Mhm,
is that I think a rational thing that people would say is like, let's say they were, again, let's just take 100 as a round number. You know,
mhm,
hey, I was earning 100, but I like this company, I like this job. I understand you maybe you can't pay that. I'd be happy for 70 or whatever. But instead of companies saying, "Oh, great, we got a discount," now they're kind of, "Huh, what's wrong? What's the catch? Why are you taking less money?" And they're not,
mhm.
and you would think more companies would bite, but a lot of them don't. A lot of them just say, same way they have that bias against people who've been out of work for so long. They're a little biased, like, why are you going to take less money? I don't get it. I don't understand. Because they're thinking of their own financial situation, saying, wait, I got this mortgage, I got this car payment, I have the other. I can't give
Mhm.
up money. Why is he giving up money? Something's up. So
Yeah.
even if you want to say, I'll take a lesser title, a lesser money, even then their antenna goes up and they're a little
Well,
sus.
people at that particular time, I would think that they're managing their lives. They
Mhm.
don't want the stress that comes with the
Oh,
extra
exactly.
money, and they don't want the lifestyle, or they don't want the burden of having to work more hours. They're trying to be at home a little bit
Yeah.
more, assuming that they're going to be out. Now, if they're working at home, uh, this is going to get really tricky about how salaries are going to change, and change the scope of the way they're being they're going to be, you know a lot more scrutiny.
Yeah.
And we've talked about market value before, and moving to from a large city to a small city before in other discussions. But I think that's gonna surprise a lot of people, how that could even change from those scenarios, because now you don't have to travel, and you don't have the headaches. Those kind of headaches. You're going to have new headaches now. Being on more Zoom calls, being, having to be on demand at certain hours of the day. It's going to get really interesting. But I think all of this kind of is driven by the article that I shared on Twitter about salary history, and how that's being asked by a lot of folks. And a lot of people don't understand that there's some states, there's 21 states, I think there's 19 or 19 to 21 states that actually have laws that employers can't ask about salary history. Now, you answered, I think, that that you don't ask. It's better not to ask about salary history. It's better to just ask what your expectations are, is what we're talking about. But I think ultimately people are going in a little bit confused and not knowing that there's salary history bands across the United States, and even
Yeah.
more interesting, that there are cities that have further bans on the state bans that they have.
Yeah. Also, on top of that, there are companies who might be in a state that you're allowed to ask, but the companies say we act as if you can't ask, because they just, so even in the states, because I'll get the
Mhm.
letters from these companies saying, hey, even though we're in a state that you're allowed to ask, that's not our policy. So in addition to those 21-ish states, there's a whole lot more, not all the companies, but a fair amount of companies. They're like, hey, we're going to act as if we can't act. So it's a
I
lot.
have I have two friends that I actually have asked. Hope they'll get back to me. That they do labor employment, unemployed, and I was going to ask them
Yeah.
which one is going to be, which one will go on whose side. If I
Yeah.
work in Idaho and someone works in California, California has those bans, but Idaho doesn't. Will employer try to
Yeah.
encroach,
Yeah.
and vice versa?
Yeah.
If the company's in Idaho and that person lives in San Francisco, not only they have the state band, but they have their own band in San Francisco.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
becomes very interesting
It's
discussion there.
when the law first came out, I was like, oh my gosh, this is gonna be so difficult. How's this gonna work? But for me, I noticed it could be a big benefit for job seekers, because
Oh, absolutely.
here's what like a typical job seeker could do. So let's say they're talking directly with the firm, and hopefully they did what you suggest, is that they did their homework and have an idea of how much other
Hmm.
people get paid in this niche, and what you feel your worth is, and so on. So then you could just say, it depends on your circumstances. If you're long-term unemployed, you might be more eager to get the role, so you might be a little bit more open. If you're currently
Hmm.
working in a good spot and you're just looking for a better one, then you have a little bit more leverage. So you could say, hey, I'm looking for something in the neighborhood, of 200,000 plus this kind of bonus, and plus, options and 4 weeks vacation. So that now you don't have that weird dance and going through the whole interview process, and you find
Right.
out that they're not open for it. So like right at the beginning, then you're setting out, here's what I want to do, here's what I need. And either they could say yay or nay. And if they say yes, then you're like, cool, okay, now I know we're on the same page. And then it takes a lot of the stress off, because now
Yes.
okay, we talked about it. We don't have to have this weird, awkward dance throughout the whole process, because, I said, hey, I'm looking for
It
200
becomes more of a
4 weeks.
conversation. It becomes
Then
more of a
everything then is
conversation
much
both ways.
easier,
Yeah.
because it flows. It flows.
Yeah.
Or it could happen where they say, sorry, we're only going to pay 100 a quarter for the job. And you're like, whoa, all right, I'm glad you let me know, because otherwise I could have spent 6 months going after this, and I'm making 130. So I would have been wasting my time.
Right.
So by doing that right out of the gate, that I think it's awkward for someone to say, let's be honest, it's awkward to say, because a lot of people are like normal, and they don't want to be like, I want this, and it's uncomfortable.
Hmm.
But you know what? If you know your value, as Mark said, and you've done your homework as Mark suggested, then you can feel comfortable. Hey, this is what I'm looking for. And
Yeah.
and if they're okay with it, that's great. If not, you know what? You move on.
Yeah, and the values in the research, and this is not only just to protect you and your interests as a job seeker, but also that you're also setting the bar for your own career for the
Yeah,
rest of your life. If you're always lowballing, or if you're not knowing, and then you find out later that somebody's making 30 or 40,000 more than you for the
dude,
exact same job,
it's
it,
so
it, it
crazy.
happens. It happens so much that it's scary that
It's
people
so
only think about it when they get to that crossroad, when it's
it's
better
so
to
crazy
know way
because it
before
held
then.
so many people back. Because let's say you started out X amount of years ago, right? And you're
Mhm.
making 30,000, and they're gonna say, well, congratulations, I'm gonna give you a 10% raise. So now you know 33,000. But to inch up and inch up and inch up, it could take years and years and years. But if
Yeah.
you, let's say you're making that 33, but you're a freaking rock star and you're awesome and you're amazing, you should be paying 70,000. If someone doesn't know
Mhm.
you're 33, then you can go out there and say, hey, I'm looking for 70. And they judge by who you are, your background, et cetera. Like, yeah, okay, you
Mhm.
have it. Boom, you doubled it overnight because you weren't prisoner to that past salary. So for a lot of people, it's a godsend. For a lot of people, it took them out, like instead of having to plod along for years and years and years, just going incrementally up, you take these big quantum leaps,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is fantastic.
And that's why a lot of people who were working in the internet in the earlier days, back in the 2000s, that's how they made jumps. And that wasn't the only one, but I'm using that as an example
Yeah,
because the market was skyrocketing with the needs
yeah,
for web developers and administrators and network administrators, et cetera. They were able to jump from job to job and to have very substantial jumps in salary. And so, and the lesson learned was it became what we know it as, every time you move, you should be able to make a somewhat substantial jump in most cases, not all, but in most, at least 20%, because 20% is actually the bottom when you jump from job. Now, if you change industry, that's a totally different discussion.
yeah.
Yeah, but if you're the same industry moving up with those skills and those skills, you keep developing those skills where you're now a subject matter expert throughout the industry, you your best moves are not going to be staying with the company for 5 years. Your best moves 2.5, 3, you're gone because you've outgrown that job, at
It-
least financially.
Absolutely. So it's so wild. So like there was like a stress when I first started recruiting, you know, the people I worked for, they would like, if you had someone who's only a year and wanted to leave, they'd be like, no, what are you doing? That doesn't happen. Fast
Mhm.
forward, in my area, there's like a 5 to 10 plus year that was just so blazing hot. You would have somebody like, "Hey, I've been here a year. I'm ready to leave," and it changed, and that was okay. And they would
Yeah.
get a 20% increase. Then a year
Mhm.
later, again, and a year later, again.
Mhm.
And think about it. If you keep getting 20% on top of like 50, 60, $70,000 before you know it, that's
Yeah.
really adding up.
Yeah. I
Really
mean,
adding
you're
up. It
you're
makes a big difference.
well, you're well into the six figures, and for a lot of people, I mean, if you're happy, you'll stay in
Yeah.
six figures and beyond that.
Yeah.
You'll go well into the six figures, but not everybody stays happy in those ones because, of course, as your salary jumps, so there's the job demands and expectations and all that. And if you could ride that wave, you're good. If you can't, then you're going to be looking to make the jump with perhaps a substantially less salary because you're
Yeah.
starting from over in most cases. In
And you see
most
a lot,
cases.
you know, there'd be a lot of resentment too, because then you have those people who kept jumping, and then they'd be working alongside somebody who, what we say is the loyalty discount, that they were there
Mhm.
for so long and then didn't jump, they didn't get those big raises. So now
Right.
you would have someone who is pretty senior, relatively senior in the organization, and then someone much junior who's making as much, if not more, because they kept boop, 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 getting those
Mhm.
jumps, and it would lead to a little conflict. But then also it would make it awkward when they would try to hire somebody, because then they would say,
Mhm.
well, Jack is only making X and we pay you this. And I'll be like, well, you're not paying the hire manager enough. if the
Right.
market is if the
Right.
market is such, that the ones who are going to work for that person is higher than the person, I think that's a you
And
problem.
that
That's
and I actually had that problem several years ago, where
did you?
there were
Yeah.
people that were under me that were making more than me. Now, some of them had access to the overtime, and
Yeah.
that's a whole nother
Yeah.
ball of wax there. But I even went to HR and went to my boss. My boss was not supportive at all for me getting a
Mm,
raise, to at least to get, to make it seem like I'm the
right.
boss. But in HR, their answer was, well, there are many situations in this organization where the boss is not making much as his employees because of the overtime situation. And I was befuddled. I didn't know what to say after that. I didn't have the experience or the depth of knowledge
Yeah.
to jump that particular shark. But all of that to say, to help some job seekers out with some very practical information and some things that they can do, is we already talked about doing the research and understanding your market and understanding your industry. If you can get involved in your industry, hopefully you'll have some side. Even if you're just on the entry level of that industry, get a part of those groups where some of those discussions really take place, in those associations and those organizations. I always say it. I know there's a bunch of career coaches who always say it. There's others who don't say it, but that's where some of that magic happens,
Mm,
because those jumps are being talked about all the time. And the first place that they go to say, hey, I'm getting ready to make a move, is their peers. They're not going to tell people who are not in the industry, that they're getting ready, because who cares if they're not in the industry? But as somebody else, they say, I'm getting ready to make this move and it's looking great. And I can tell you the culture, this, that, and other. And that takes relationships as well. But I think a lot of people who are been long-term unemployed are afraid to go all in on making the
yeah.
relationships work for them.
Yeah. It's because they're just saying, hey, I just want to get back to work. So it's tough.
Right.
They're operating from a
But you
tough
gotta,
negotiating
but
part.
unfortunately, you got to swing to get a hit.
Yeah. It's almost like
Uh,
you just got to change your personality just for that time. Like even if it's everything is bothering you, even if you're feeling down and out, it's almost like, okay, you know what? I'm not that person today. Today is a different person that's
and
going
we're
into
not
the
talking
community.
about being schizophrenic here. We're
Yeah,
talking
yeah,
about making a conscious decision. Okay, I
yeah,
need to connect. So I need to really, you're being who you truly are.
yeah,
And that is that you're a person that people like, that they enjoy, that's knowledgeable, and you stop being that person because you've been away from the game for so long. So I
yeah,
think you just need to become that person again, that who where people like to connect, who like to work with you and even hire you, and become that person again. I think that's the opposite,
yeah,
where people think that they're not that person because of the way they feel at that moment. And that has a lot to do with being resilient. And it also has to do a lot with being persistent. Remember, a few weeks ago, we also talked about following up, right?
mhm,
We talked about how people need to be consistent, and not be afraid to ask a second time. Say, hey, you remember we had this conversation? I was hoping that you give me the name to that person that you said that you knew that might be able to help me get further along in this process. Don't be afraid to ask those questions, and to be a little, and ask a second, and sometimes a little third time. Give a little time, but don't be afraid to ask them. Be a little bit more um audacious.
you have to be. I agree with you.
Yeah,
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 it's like you have no other choice. You have to be,
yeah,
even if that's maybe you don't have to do it every single day, but when it counts, you have to kind of turn it on.
yeah, yeah. And I think too, you may have to do something that may be a little bit more bolder than you usually do. So bold usually means the thing that you hate to do, now you probably want to
Yeah,
do. You say, I need to connect with 10 people and try to have 5 informational interviews this week. That's bold.
yeah,
It may not seem like a lot to some people who do it all the time, but for you, that's what bold, that takes you
yeah,
out of that. You'll need to do that thing, and to learn how to navigate that area so that you can move things forward. But something that you normally don't do, go ahead and try to do that thing.
Absolutely. That's great advice. That's great advice.
Yeah, do more. I mean, you can think of other scenarios where you can just be bold, that you're going to talk to some family members that you haven't talked to in a long time, and just, even if it's just letting them know, say, hey, I've been looking for a little bit, and blah blah. You may not even have to even ask them for help, but just because that's something that you normally don't do, you got to break some norms now, and you've got to be uncomfortable. It's just
Yeah. But
as
once you
far as
do it, then you feel good about yourself because like you feel proud, you did it, you tried it,
yeah, yeah,
right?
absolutely.
And then it's
Yeah,
worth it. So what,
yeah.
and then you think about it, a little bit of discomfort and it can turn into a lifetime of a better life, more money, more opportunity, better
Hmm.
job, better career. So
Yep,
the trade-off is, at least it's worth trying.
yep. And hopefully you'll continue to be even a little or
Mhm.
more audacious while you're working. When you get the job, that you'll continue that, because that is something you want. You don't want to be left holding the bag
Mhm.
ever again, because a year is a
Yeah.
long time. I don't think I've ever been, fortunately, count my
Yeah.
lucky stars, I never experienced a year of unemployment.
Yeah.
And I think underemployment too can feel sort of the same way. That because you have to work more hours at a job that you don't like just to meet the bills than you did before, that now you're a slave to that job. It's hard to find
Yeah.
time, and that becomes
Yeah.
really difficult.
You know what? That's a sore point for me in the sense that when, you know, we look at the jobs report and I write about the jobs report, they
Mhm.
don't really take into consideration people who are underemployed. And I don't know the numbers on it, but I gotta imagine it's huge. And yes, you have a job, but if you were an architect down working for Disney and you lost your job and now you're driving an Uber, yes, you have a job, but let's be real, that's not what you signed up to do. So
Right.
it's a job, but it's you can't compare
And
it to
you're
being that architect and building rides for Disney. It's just
and your loans are much more than the job that you're working
yeah,
underemployment, and that becomes it's quite a burden. And
that's
for
yeah,
some people, I understand that that's a choice, because there are some people who do underemployment because they're chasing their dream job or their dream situation.
absolutely.
I
Absolutely.
We get that.
Yeah,
But the ones that have been, because of the layoffs or because the
yeah,
industry is shrinking, and that they have to take some other job, whatever they can get, that becomes a stress factor that nobody ever can.
yeah,
And the BLS, they don't count underemployment, and they
yeah.
couldn't count it accurately because there's so many people
It's
who
hard to
don't
figure
report
right.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah, they don't report it. So, because they've run out of unemployment, now they're taking something and they can't be counted anymore, and they're considered part of that unknown number. So it's very difficult. So great discussion.
wow, we covered a
Uh,
lot of ground, huh?
we covered a lot of ground,
A
and
lot
I
of
think
inside stuff too.
yeah, I think that's why I actually love this show.
Yeah,
That we do the things that really I rarely hear about. So
right.
glad to be a part of it with you, sir.
Yep,
And
that's
did you
great.
want to add anything before we sign off?
I'll just echo kind of what you were saying. I think to put a point on it as well is that if you're part of that long-term unemployed, you got to somehow disassociate yourself with everything that happened before, and then just go into that interview, go into that when you're networking, and just be that different person, be that person you want to be and you know you can be, and just go there. And as Mark said, it could be a little uncomfortable, a little awkward, but push yourself through it.
Yep, yep, yep. You've got to be willing to
Yeah,
you've got to be willing to risk it, but you're not your last job,
yeah,
and you're not your current situation. You're not, and you
exactly.
shouldn't feel that way, and do whatever you can to get up. Anything coming up for you, Jack?
No,
Where
but
you
except
going to
I'm watching
be?
a lot of basketball this weekend, so with half hour. So I'll be up to speed when we have for next week. I'll be prepared.
You have a live show tomorrow, right?
I
Coming up.
do, yeah. Yeah, and it's gonna be different topic, all about, how to deal with job stress,
Mhm.
We have a couple folks on there, Crystal and Sabrina, who probably talk about mindfulness, all sorts of other techniques to kind of get you through, some difficult times.
Yes, Sabrina, I talk to
Yeah.
every now and then. Wonderful person.
Yeah.
So that should be a great show tomorrow. I'll be watching in. I get to present at the Career Thought Leaders Symposium
Nice.
tomorrow.
That's
So
what is that?
I'll be
Where
doing
is that? What's
that's
that?
virtual. It's
Everywhere,
virtual.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
everywhere people are registered. So I'll be doing
Oh,
that.
great.
And there's a bunch of podcasts I've been on and I'm going to be on coming up here. So
Awesome.
that will be a lot of fun. In the meantime, thank you very much for joining.
Awesome.
Job
Excellent.
Seeker Nation,
Yes.
hook us up with your problems and questions anytime you like. Follow our profiles. You guys have a great afternoon, and we'll
Thanks.
see you
Thanks,
next
everyone.
Wednesday. Thanks,
Thanks.
Jack.
Take care, Mark. Take care.